Okay, so we are entering slow season, which is one of 3 times when landlords are particularly vulnerable to taking tenants that they probably shouldn't take. The other 2 are applicable to the rest of the year, and I'll talk about those in a second. But the reason why this particular time of the year landlords are vulnerable is because we are going into slow season for the majority of the United States. So for most of the US, I would say the exception would be California, Florida, Arizona. Slow season is November and December, and that is because of the weather and also because of the holidays. Now, you would think the holidays would also impact those states as well, but you just don't see it impact them as much as it does everybody else. And that is because there's a lot going on. So people don't want to move, so they're not looking for rentals, and all of a sudden you notice depressed interest in your listing and you're thinking, what am I going to do? And then when someone shows up that you maybe wouldn't take if you have a lot of interest, all of a sudden you're compromising, ignoring red flags and saying, well, maybe I could do it with this person. So this video hopefully will be instructional around how to protect yourself from a rogue tenant, but also how to protect yourself from yourself when you are feeling like, I don't know what's going on with my listing. So the agenda for this video will be the other times when you're vulnerable to taking a bad tenant, how to avoid taking a bad tenant. So I have 3 tips that I think most experienced landlords adhere to. Then I'll talk about a product that I just installed in my own home and I'm installing in my other properties because it will give me more peace of mind. And then finally, I will talk about the bad experience that we had 2 years ago, what happened, how I've set up protections going forward, and also how everything shook out in the end because they were pretty bad tenants. Okay, so first let's talk about when you're vulnerable to these not ideal tenants. So the first is going into slow season, November and December. You're not getting a lot of interest, you're getting in your head. Second time shows up any time of the year, and that's when a tenant, the too good to be true tenant, shows up. Now, they're not really too good to be true because you're probably seeing red flags, there's issues. If they have a great credit score and everything checks out, then they are good. They're not too good to be true. What we're worried about more is when someone shows up and you like them as a person, but they have something questionable in their credit history, their employment history, their criminal background, but they want to rent for a year and they want to rent for a lot. And all of a sudden you're thinking, well, I wouldn't have vacancy. I wouldn't have to worry about it. How big of a deal is this really? Which leads us to the third way that you're vulnerable to a bad tenant. And that is just not having it written out of what you will accept and what you won't. If you write it down, then you'll have clear parameters even when you're feeling like a little bit desperate because people aren't interested. So hopefully this video will be instructional to you as far as you can write down things as I go along and say, yes, this is my limit, this is not. With that, I'll also talk about the average or usual credit score of a tenant in the United States so that you can make an informed decision. Because it's one thing to get a credit score back, but you don't even necessarily know what that credit score means. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so this maybe should come up later in the video, but I'll just talk about it here. And it's the deposit. So different platforms are going to handle the deposit differently. On Airbnb, you don't take a deposit, you don't have a lease, and you don't do a background check, which is a lot of risk. But the reason why Airbnb does this is because they have their host protection guarantee air cover, and it is up to $3 million for your property and up to $1 million for personal liability. So they do this because they essentially are acting as the tenant to you. It should give you some peace of mind. It gives me some peace of mind, but it's not a perfect system. And the reason why it's not a perfect system is because you have Airbnb deciding if you're going to get paid back or not. Whereas if you have a deposit, you control that. So I prefer having a deposit. However, it's not an option on Airbnb. So on the other platforms, typical for midterm rentals, Zillow and Furnished Finder, you can and you should take a security deposit, a lease, and do a background check. Now, I think that Zillow has already had this product for a while, and now you're seeing Furnished Finder unroll something too, where there's a product where you can buy insurance coverage for the deposit. So instead of asking someone to take a deposit, you're going to pay a company and then you're going to be protected that way. So in some ways, it's mirroring what Airbnb is doing. An air cover obviously takes fees from both the tenant and the guest, and those fees, or at least some of those fees, go toward air cover. Now on Zillow and Furnished Finder, they're asking you to pay for this extra product that will help protect you. The same issue exists here. I don't love it because then some third party is deciding whether or not you're going to get paid out. And like any insurance, if you use them, they might penalize you, and also they might not always cover you, and they probably have their own set of cut-ins. I know Furnished Finder unrolled something in the last week or two. I haven't looked into it, but that's something where you want to be really specific with them about what do you cover, what do you not cover, what is the risk with my personal property. Zillow, I know they have something, but I'm not going to speak to it because I haven't done a deep dive, and also because this video is about taking a deposit, because taking a deposit is your best way to protect yourself. If you have the deposit, you control when you get made whole and how you get made whole. And as a note on that, I do not like taking a pet deposit because a pet deposit confuses things. You don't care if your couch gets destroyed by the 30-year-old, the 3-year-old, or the lab. All you care about is that you make yourself whole. So I don't recommend doing a pet deposit. I recommend just having a whole deposit. Now with that, some platforms are recommending a much lower deposit than I would suggest. So the standard deposit for long-term unfurnished rentals has been equal to 1 month's rent. So your deposit is equal to 1 month's rent. And before you ever hand over the keys, you get the full deposit and you get the full first month's rent. So you get equal to 2 months rent before you ever hand over the keys. Now I am seeing Furnished Finder is suggesting a much lower deposit. I'm also hearing about tenants trying to negotiate that deposit. Now, I don't like that at all because essentially midterm rentals are just long-term furnished rentals. So even though midterm renters kind of shop like short-term renters, they behave very similarly to long-term renters. And so once they're in, they should kind of be treated and navigated the same way we would with long-term renters. And the reason why a deposit is equal to 1 month's rent in a long-term rental is because you're protecting your appliances, you're protecting the walls around you. Well, in a midterm rental, you have even more risk because you probably have a couch that may be $1,000 or more in the property. You have your appliances, you have a desk, you have mattresses, etc. And all of those things are vulnerable to a tenant doing something. And in fact, I would argue they're more vulnerable to getting damage outside of wear and tear than a long-term rental is because they're going to use the couch, they're going to use the bed, right? And things go wrong sometimes. So for that reason, I think you need to have a deposit equal to 1 month's rent to protect yourself. The other reason why I like having a deposit equal to 1 month's rent is because if a tenant comes in and they can't pay a deposit equal to 1 month's rent, they may not be a good tenant for you. They may not be able to afford your property. And this is certainly a filtering system to establish whether or not they have the money. Just like you get excited when there's the prospect of a tenant that's going to come in for 12 months and all of a sudden you're ignoring red flags, a tenant also might come into your property, see that it's super cute, and start to convince themselves that they can afford the property when really they can't. And maybe, possibly, the first indicator of that is going to be them negotiating down the deposit. So you definitely want a tenant in there that can pay for the property. And the thing about this is that if they are going to treat your property with respect, they shouldn't be too worried about the deposit because it's a refundable deposit. They're going to get it back if they have treated the property well. And as a heads up, I don't know if this is true in other states, but in Colorado, if a landlord takes a deposit illegally, so the tenant really hasn't done anything, the tenant can sue the landlord for up to triple the amount of the deposit if they're being shady. And I know this because when I was 20, our landlord did that. He said that there was cat pee all over the carpet in the basement, and there was no carpet in the basement, and we didn't have a cat. So that was not true. And all of a sudden, when we threatened to go to small claims court, he was negotiating all over the place. So I suspect that a lot of states have laws like that because they really don't want the landlords taking advantage of the tenants. And this is something that you might point out to the tenant that is arguing about the deposit or wants a decreased deposit. You might just say, this is how I protect myself, and also the state protects you. Another way to signal this is to be really thorough in the walkthrough, and that could be a video that the tenant signs off on, or you going through the property and walking through it with them and letting them send you a list. That way you are letting them know that you are a conscientious landlord that wants them to be happy. Also, that both of you agreed on the state of the property before they took over the keys and the responsibility, and you accepted their deposit. All right, before we get into rule 2, a couple housekeeping items. If you feel like you are learning something, please like this video. If you want more information on how to self-property manage as a landlord, which I strongly recommend doing if you are in the midterm or long-term space, I do not recommend it for short-term, but if you are in that space and you're interested in more education on that, you might consider subscribing. I will have a lot more videos about the platforms coming out at the end of the year and at the beginning of the year, some different strategies you can do to get tenants there. If you are looking for consulting, I offer a 1-hour package, a 2-hour package, or a hold my hand package. The hold my hand package is one where I set you up on the platform, I vet and set your first tenant, and I hang out for the first month. You also have access to coaching. All of that is included in the package, and it's probably my most popular package. Alternately, if you are looking to buy a property, I also provide midterm rental audits. If you're trying to figure out what the interest is in a particular market, or if the property that you're considering makes sense for a midterm or a long-term rental, depending on what you want to do. The audit is also popular for people that just don't want to be on the phone or on video, and they just want the information, but they don't want to take a call, and the price is the same. Okay, second, let's talk about credit score. I know that this is so boring, and you're like, I came to this video just to be told to get a credit score. And the answer is yes. And the reason for that is because experienced landlord and hosts understand that a credit score is an unbiased report or number on the way that people manage their money and ultimately kind of their lives. This is something I don't like about Airbnb, is that in their verification process, they do not look at the credit score. They look to make sure that you say who you are, but they don't care about the credit score. And part of the reason why they don't care about the credit score is because you have to pay them, and then they will ultimately protect the host, or they say they will protect the host, and that's why they don't care. So it's kind of, it is a way for people that actually don't have a stronger credit to still get a rental, is to go through Airbnb, because then they have Airbnb's backing. So if you're outside of Airbnb, again, if you're on Zillow or Furnished Finder, couple things to know. So in the state of Colorado, and I think that this may get federal adoption, but in Colorado at least, if a tenant has had their credit pulled in the last 30 days from one of the major credit reporting agencies or from an application, then you have to take that. You can't require them to pull it again. And the reason why the state does this is because they don't want a tenant's credit being pulled all the time, because that's not great for the tenant. And the other reason is that within 30 days, it's a fresh credit score. And the credit comes from one of 3 places. It's TransUnion, Experian, and somewhere else. But basically, it's going to be the same thing if you pull their credit as well. So you may as well use the credit score as long as it's 30 days or fewer. And you have to take it from all of the major agencies, at least in Colorado. But I think it's a good practice for landlords to carry in other states as well, whether it's required or not, because it creates goodwill with your tenant and you are still equally protected. There's not a lot of risk with that. So now let's talk about the actual credit score and what a credit score looks like. So this is a book I wrote about midterm rentals in 2023. I have 2 other books, Guide to Midterm Rentals and American Nomads. American Nomads being about the different tenant types that would potentially want your midterm rental, your furnished long-term rental. And then Guide to Midterm Rentals is obviously how to set it up from beginning to end. And then this is a workbook. This workbook is actually relevant to the conversation we're having right now, because you record different information in it, and it's kind of like the landlord's Bible. Okay, so that advertisement / sales pitch aside, on page 63 of this book, we talk about 2023 tenant stats. So 35% of the US rents. Zillow reports the national average rent to income ratio is 29%. Credit scoring, excellent, is 800 plus. Very good is 740 to 799. Good is 670 to 739. The average credit score in the United States is 698. And just a couple of other things to know. 28% of rental applicants have a criminal record, 72% of renters have a pet, and single people are more likely to rent than couples. Some items that you want to pay attention to when you're looking at a credit score beyond just the number is the on-time payment. So what is the number for that? The established monthly payment. So how much they're having to pay for other bills. So student loans, car payments, stuff like that. The credit used. So this would be their debt to income ratio. So how much credit is being used. And then also you want income verification for how much they make. So typically what you wanted to see was a renter that made 3 times or more what your actual rent is. You didn't want your rent to cost them more than 33% of their monthly income. Right now, for most places in the US, it's a 1-to-3 ratio. In Colorado, it's illegal to discriminate against anyone if they have a 1-to-2 ratio, meaning that their rent is not more than 50% of their income, monthly income, right? So those are all things that you want to pay attention to. Right now, I'm looking at an example of a Zillow rental application, and it breaks it down for you really nicely. And again, as the landlord, you don't have to pay for this, the tenant does. Before we move on to the product that I just bought for my personal property, and I recommend people put in their rentals, one other thing that you want to do is just make sure that anything that you are relying on information-wise is not self-reported, that you're actually backing it up. So if their income, you're calling the HR department and getting a confirmation on that, or some kind of third-party system is telling you that that's real. That's part of the reason why people rely so much on the credit score, is that somebody can't fake that. They put in their social security and then it gets delivered to your email inbox, the credit score, not their social security. But there's no way for them to manipulate that, or if they can, it's very complicated, not something I can speak to. But it's a quick snapshot of how they spend money and how responsible they are with money. So that's why people like the credit score so much, and anything else that you see in the credit report, make sure that it's not self-reported, or if it is self-reported, you then call a number and verify it. Okay, so for the product that I really like, it's something that I just bought. I will link to it in the description. An Amazon associate, which means if you click on that link, I get a little cut of it. You don't pay more, Amazon pays me. The reason why I like this product is because I just had my fireplace fixed, and the fireplace guy that was over said, hey, you really need to have a carbon monoxide detector in your house. In addition to that, all of our smoke alarms were getting a little bit old. And so even though this costs more money, I got a combo carbon monoxide smoke detector that has Wi-Fi capability. So it will tell me if the smoke detector is going off in the house, or if the carbon monoxide is going off in the house, even if I'm not there, which is of particular concern to me for my dogs. But you would also care about this in your rentals. So is there smoke and no one's addressing it, or the tenant hasn't called you, or you can't get a hold of them? Same thing with the carbon. So it's a great way to keep your property safe and to keep your tenants safe. And again, I'll link to the one that I like, that I've been using, in the description. I have found the interface in the app really easy to use. You can always tell when it's on, which is nice and gives me, because I'm a little bit paranoid, peace of mind. Okay, and then the third way that you can protect yourself if you are a little bit nervous about a tenant or they have some red flags. Let's talk about this before we talk about my nightmare scenario with my tenants. Third way to protect yourself when you're feeling vulnerable, nobody's real interested in your property, you're not sure what to do, some red flags are going off. We'll talk about that in a second. Quick tangent on this. James and I are kind of going through this on one of our properties. So the property is about to come up. It's about to be open, and we had someone secured for November through February, which is really ideal because that is the super slow time, November and December, but it's not like January and February are great. So we were excited about this person, but as time marched forward and it got closer to the date that they were supposed to move in, so early November, the story changed, the number of people changed, because I was asking her, hey, I need you to update that on Airbnb, because we charge for pets, we charge for more adults, right? So I need to have exactly who's going to be in there listed, and I also need you to give me the names of everyone 18 plus that's going to be there. This is a good way to prevent subleasing and also just have clarity about who's in your property. Also, if you have like college students, this is a great way to prevent fights. If somebody's boyfriend or girlfriend starts to move in and they're there all the time, you can put a little note in saying anyone that stays 5 or more nights for the month, I need their name. They potentially need to be on the rent. Anyways, this woman was changing up her story and I got spooked and I canceled it. And the reason why I did that is because she wasn't being consistent, and that's a problem. And she also didn't have any reviews. So I wasn't real crazy about taking her when the stories are changing. Now, when you do this, you get in your head a little bit like, I probably just threw away a November through February rent. That would have been so easy. She would have paid. It probably wouldn't have been a big deal. But you can never prove to yourself when you have prevented a tenant nightmare. So you just have to be comfortable with that. And again, this is a good reason to write down what you're willing to take and what you're not willing to take before you get into that situation. This is a good one to think about, like for someone that wants to rent for a year. Let's say they're on the line with their credit score. Let's say they have a 600 credit score, and let's say they have an 85% on-time payment history. That is okay. I don't love that, but it's shown up. They're going to rent for a full year. They're going to pay full price. They don't mind paying the deposit. And you're like, it's really tempting. I want to take this person. So what you could do is say, I'm going to put you on a 3-month lease. We're going to come in, look at the property, establish if we like working together, and then we're going to do the other 9 months if I'm satisfied at that point. And if you're happy with me, then we'll continue the relationship. I recommend communicating to the tenant why you are doing this. Maybe say, I'm just a little bit paranoid about this, so if we could do a 3-month lease and then we'll do a 9-month lease after that if all parties are happy, and I will keep the price the same. I just want to make sure that it's a good fit. And again, you might have some tenants walk away because perhaps they were sneaking something into the property that they shouldn't have, which I will talk about in my story here in a minute, or for some reason they're just uncomfortable with it. You have to be okay absorbing that risk to protect yourself. Okay, and then finally, what happened to us? So we had some tenants come in. They were coming from Texas. They were leaving Texas. This was like 2022. They were not feeling comfortable with some of the decisions that Texas was making. James and I were also not feeling very comfortable about some of the decisions that Texas was making. So we felt some sympathy for these tenants, but then we ran their credit check and the credit check was not good. So we went back to them and we said, we just can't rent to you. We're not comfortable. The credit score is not where we want it to be, so we're not going to do that. Well, they then got us on the phone. They emailed us. We had been talking to them for about a month at that point, begging, like, we are good tenants. We just really want to leave Texas. We love your property. We promise we'll take care of it. We'll pay you 6 months up front. We'll pay you time and a half on the deposit. Like, please, please let us in. So because we're bleeding hearts, we decided to let them in, and then they lived there for a year. Now, one smart thing we did, which I recommend doing, is that we made every single person responsible for the full amount of the lease. So if somebody walked off, everybody was responsible for it. But then when we took back over the property after the year was over, we saw they had snuck in 2 cats. And not only had they snuck in the cats, they allowed the cats to pee. And not only did they allow the cats to pee, but they let it sit there. So when we took over the property, it smelled a lot like cat urine. And then there was cat hair in the curtains. A lot of the upholstery had actually been kind of damaged, maybe by cats, maybe by children, I don't know, but the place didn't look good. However, we had time and a half for the deposit. So we took the full deposit, and then we had to pay $3,000 out of pocket of our own money to get the place back to where it needed to be. Now, I was super freaked out and upset, but ultimately, when you looked at what they paid us for rent and the deposit, they had paid us close to $40,000 over the full year, and we had to pay $3,000 out of pocket to get us back to where we needed to be. So when you look at it that way, and when you step back and look at the big picture, it doesn't mean that you're going to be happy about rogue tenants or tenants that are abusing your property. It will piss you off. It will scare you. It was upsetting too because we had new tenants coming in, and I thought, are we going to lose our new tenants because we have a limited amount of time to make this right? But ultimately, this is part of real estate investing. It's part of the risk you take. But one good thing to keep in mind is that the risk of a wrong decision is better than the terror of indecision. Who said that? I know Carmela Soprano said that in one episode, but it looks like that quote is attributed to a guy that I would pronounce his name as Maimonides. I don't know. Anyways, I agree with this quote. There's nothing that you're going to do in life that is going to be risk-free. You have to take some risk, and the best thing you can do is plan around it, plan ways to protect yourself, and you should be doing that now before the decision is in front of you. If you are looking for information on consulting in the midterm rental space, whether that's the 1 hour, the 2 hour, the audit, or the hold my hand package, check out this video.